You might have noticed that pirate ships are made out of wood. And not the kind of wood I hoist in the morning when rolling out of my hammock. A half-drunken rum punch, but the stuff you take from trees. It is an excellent building material, sturdy enough to not fall apart and soft enough to be malleable. But since it is organic, it is susceptible to rot. But most wooden ships would have a decent lifespan of around 50 years. Unless they went to the Caribbean. You see, in the Caribbean, in all tropical waters, lives the teredo, also known as the shipworm. It isn't actually a worm, but a mollusk. It even has a shell, which is used for boring into wood. That's right, the teredo eats wood. Now, wood isn't the only thing it eats. It's not a picky eater. It primarily sustains itself on plankton, but it isn't called a shipworm without good reason. They would reduce the lifespan of a European ship from 50 years to perhaps 10. The mollusk is translucent, and at night, sailors could see them glowing under the dark sea like tiny candles, as if the creatures were holding mass. If the teredos had their way, the bottom of the hull would be reduced to a honeycomb, with planks as thin as a penny. One privateer remarked how they were able to press their thumbs through the worm-eaten planking. Now imagine what a cannonball could do to it. In addition, all sorts of maritime growth like seaweed and blistering barnacles would attach itself to the bottom of the ship, turning this smooth and aquadynamic surface to a rough and clumsy sandpaper. Poor maintenance meant poor speed. A pirate who did not clean his ship stood a chance of missing good targets, or even getting caught by pirate hunters who had been more diligent. Furthermore, ships could be damaged by storms, not to mention battles, so the need for repairs and maintenance was frequent, at least once every 3 months. The process was far from easy. It required a skilled crew, a skilled carpenter, all the while it made pirates susceptible to attack. They needed to find a good location. Before finding a good location, the pirates had to decide what method was necessary to maintain their ship. If it had recently been cleaned and just sustained some minor damage, it wasn't necessary to bring it ashore and carry out serious maintenance. Ships could sustain damage from a variety of causes. Pieces of the rig could get damaged by sailors slacking at work, old rotten ropes snapping, or even just a rogue wind. Ships in a fleet might collide, they could get stuck on reefs or strike hidden rocks. They were especially susceptible during storms, when damage could be done to the sails, rigging, masts, and even the hull itself. Then there was damage during combat. Muskets and artillery would damage the sails and rig. Some artillery was heavy enough to damage the hull, and even if it wasn't, the bullets might knock out the oakum between the planking, leading to leakage. Repairs could be undertaken even within these situations. During storms and battle, carpenters and their assistants could be found below deck with shot plugs, ready to literally plug any potential leaks. Men were put to work on the pumps to force out the water. Right after the battle, or in the lull, a carpenter could be lowered using rope and canvas over the side to plug the holes with plugs, tarred cloth, using a mallet. After the disaster in question, the ship could be jury-rigged. These are temporary makeshift repairs undertaken to ensure that the vessel can sail long enough until proper repairs can be made. These usually involve the masts and rigging, which were arguably more susceptible during storms and engagements. It usually involved lashing spars to what remained of the masts so that a sail could be hoisted. These sorts of rigs were incredibly slow, and only a desperate move to get the ship into a safe enough harbor for proper repairs. If the hull was damaged, it could be woolded, that is, wrapped around with thick cables to literally hold her together. and Captain Kidd did this with the Adventure Galley. What limited repairs at sea was access to tools and materials. A ship could only carry so much. The items necessary could be acquired from robbery at sea, or by making landfall, harvesting and producing them. So if the damage was serious enough and the ship didn't have the materials necessary, making landfall and undertaking hard repairs was a must. A similar process often undertaken during repairs and cleaning was ship modification. Pirates would modify their ships to make them more suitable for combat, to make them more seaworthy in rough seas, or even to make them easier to handle. This usually involved the adding of gun ports and artillery, the severing of heavy superstructures, and raising or lowering of masts, possibly adding or removing sails. Moving on to cleaning, ships could also be cleaned out on the open ocean. You've probably heard of sailors scrubbing the decks. Pirates are often slack at this practice. The lower decks also had to be ventilated of their horrible stench, usually by burning vinegar or tobacco. And people back then believed that disease spread by smell, miasma theory. More important was cleaning the outside of the ship, the lower part of the hull, to keep it free from maritime growth. This could be done at sea in a limited manner with a process called boot topping. The boot top is a painted line on the hull that indicates the waterline. Boot topping was the act of cleaning the part of the hull just below this line, immediately under the surface of the water, and daubing over with tallow or a mixture of tallow, sulfur, and resin. This act did not require the ship to be tilted or moved out of the water, and could be done with a flat scrubbing broom called a hog or goree. If the bottom was filthy enough, but there wasn't any time or space for careening, the ship could be washed. This move seems to have been quite dangerous and may only have been undertaken in times of desperation. Firstly, the ship was tilted by moving all of the guns to one side, and also have parts of the crew climb into the rig on that side to add further weight. With the bottom then bared, the other crewmen would go down in boats, scrub the bottom clean, and coat it in tallow. The same was repeated for the other side. This move was only possible on a calm sea, and a sudden disturbance could be very dangerous. I imagine a ship being chased could do this during a sudden doldrum in order to get some space from the attacker, right before the wind picked back up. Finally, we come to the subject of this video, careening. The process in which a ship was beached and tilted on its side, cleaned and repaired. All the while a camp was erected to supply the repairs and entertain the men. The first move was to find a suitable location. If you ever look at a map of the New World, you will find that a lot of early colonies and especially pirate hideouts were erected in suitable harbors. These had to be clear of dangerous rocks or reefs, keep the ship safe from the wind, and contain a beach suitable for careening. It also had to be defensible, contain a supply of raw materials, and food and water for the company to sustain itself. A perfect example of a careenage is a small island in Samana Bay, in the modern-day Dominican Republic, to this day named after a pirate captain, Joseph Bannister. Remnants of his ship were discovered there in 2009. The nearby cove is called Port Bannister, even if he careened the ship on a sizable island between the mainland and a triangular reef. The position was highly defensible, with trespassers having to pass through the channel to avoid getting stuck on the reef. One popular pirate careenage was the island of Roatan, a small island 65 kilometers off the coast of Honduras. It was both relatively isolated from any major Spanish parts, making it safe from retaliations. Pirates were highly susceptible when careening and needed a place to hide. At the same time, it wasn't far from lucrative targets. it houses a vast number of tiny coves and islands, where ships could safely be careened and kept away from the wind, or unfriendly, prying eyes. Then there were a number of careenages so excellent that they became permanent settlements. These included pirate capitals like Port Royal, New Providence, Betagh, and St. Mary on Madagascar. All of them were defensible and secure. Betagh can be given as an abbreviated example, simply because this location was an incredibly prominent pirate base in the late 17th century, despite being almost forgotten. It was arguably the most important pirate base of the period. Anyway, on the eastern part of the island of Hispaniola, midway up the northern coast of the Tiburon Peninsula, lies a small bay called Betagh. On the eastern side lay a settlement, and the entrance was protected by a sandbar. A local pilot was needed to pass it securely. The town was protected by a fort. On the opposite side of the bay is a small peninsula, creating a smaller bay called Akul. At the entrance of this bay lies multiple islands, creating a windbreak that made Akul an excellent spot for careening. At some point in the 18th century, the bay was even fortified. When the pirates had found a suitable location, they would make landfall, beach the vessel, and begin the erecting of a camp. When a good location had been found, the first step was to send a party ashore to collect materials and begin the construction of the camp. A number of specialists were necessary to conduct the careening safely and successfully. Inexperienced pirates might risk their lives, damaging the ship, or even losing it outright. Of course, practice makes perfect. Even uneducated pirates could pick up skills and ideas over time to improve the careening process. Most important was the carpenter, a man educated in working with wood. He knew what tools, materials, and techniques to use for cleaning and repairing the ship. Even better was the shipwright, a carpenter specialized in the construction of ships. He was so intimately connected with their infrastructure that he'd know best how to maintain it. Another type of woodworker that could be employed was the cooper, a man specialized in binding barrels and casks. These were used for storing water and provisions, which the pirates would fill up during their stay. Barrels could also be dismantled and used as building material. If the sails were damaged, sailmakers were needed for mending them, using long needles. Ships do not only consist of wood, but also ironwork, holding the planks together. Metal workers were rare and arguably more desired than the woodworkers, since the latter were common at sea, and many sailors would pick up enough skills to be able to carry out careening and even construct simple vessels. So how would these experts be acquired? Privateer crews from larger cities, like those in Europe or even some colonies, would usually have them in their employ. Captains like Woodes Rogers and George Shelvocke wrote detailed accounts of their camps, documenting in their companies coopers, blacksmiths, sailmakers, caulkers, and carpenters. Of course. Pirates might have been more hard-pressed for specialists, either because they weren't stupid enough to join them, or simply owing to scarcity. Many crews were also small. A midpoint between pirates and privateers, William Dampier described his buccaneer crew as consisting of sawyers, carpenters, joiners, brickmakers, bricklayers, shoemakers, tailors, etc. All of whom had relevant skills for the camp building and careening process. Dampier also made note of the tools and materials found aboard, including iron, lead, saws, axes, hammers, etc. If pirates needed a specialist, they would usually kidnap them from ships they captured or towns they ransacked. The terms of forced service might be short, simply the duration of the careening. Help us out and we'll let you go. In a lot of cases, the assistance was even paid for. John Cox, an old shipmate of Dampier, wrote how the crew hired a notable shipwright to assist them in modifying their ship. Those Indians told us that up another river lived a shipwright who was building 2 new ships. This was welcome news to us, so we went up to the carpenter's yard and friendly desired the chief builder and 7 of his workmen to go on board us and help us cut down our ship. He also helped us to a canoe load of spikes and ironwork. When the ship was finished, we gave the carpenter and his men of the barks and sent them home, who returned us many thanks for our generosity and using them so civilly. This scenario paints a very rosy picture. It is not certain if the workers were compensated or if any form of force was involved. Anything is possible. But it does show how pirates were able to locate skilled artisans and materials, put them to work, and release them. Naturally, they were probably quite shy about documenting these cases, since the workmen might be punished for receiving payment from the scalawags. Aside from the specialists, all of the crewmen had to be delegated to certain tasks. Help with construction, raising tents, cooking, gathering materials, and so on. Most of the hard labor was delegated to slaves or forced men. Having been sent ashore, the carpenters would go about searching for materials, suitable trees or salvageable wreckage that could be used for repairing the ship, building camp features, or whatever else they needed. Hunters would delve into the wilderness to search for game, which they would cut up into long, thin strips and roast over a wooden grill into a proto-jerky called boucané or barbecue. Strikers, usually Native American spearfishers, would go off in canoes and hunt for turtle, manatee, or fish. Other men would go and harvest fresh fruit, vegetables, and herbs, and others fresh water from a nearby source. Some would also have to gather and process materials like tar, planking, oakum, and charcoal for the smithy. If the company was large, the camp could be absolutely massive. Rogers' company named their camp Little Bristol, after their home port. These camps consisted of various habitations. The most rudimentary were tents made from the sails of the ship. Others were content with sleeping under the cover of trees or even inside of large water barrels. Huts could also be constructed from locally harvested materials. Usually they were quite simple. A number of poles with a roof, thatched with palm leaves. No walls were necessary in the tropical heat. In colder climates, simple walls could be constructed or even covered with cloth or the skins of maritime animals like seals and sea lions. Tents were first and foremost prioritized for the officers and the craftsmen who needed cover. Their work, tools, and materials had to be protected. Storehouses or tents could also be made for food, materials, ammunition, and plunder. The most complex construction would be the smithy, as it required a forge. Here the aforementioned bricklayers and brickmakers might come of use. It certainly required some effort, but if you gave the smith a good facility, he could truly accomplish great things. Ironwork was actually quite rare in the period, often being supplanted in ships by wooden nails called trenails. So pirates would always make sure to acquire spare ironwork in whatever way possible, even just to sell it. A skilled smith could then melt down the ironwork and craft it into nails. Anything made of metal could be melted. One pirate crew melted down Spanish swords. The ingenuity of one privateer smith named Poppleston was documented by Captain Shelvocke. In 2 months we made a tolerable show, owing in great measure to the ingenuity of Poppleston, our armorer, who never lost a minute working with his hands or contriving in his head. He made us a small double-headed maul, hammers, chisels, and a sort of gimlets or wimbles, which performed very well. He even made a bullet mold and cartridge boxes fashioned from the trunks of our gun carriages, covering them with seal skins, and not only convenient, but neat. He contrived any ironwork wanted by the carpenter, and even finished a large serviceable boat, of which we stood much in need. Sail ships and the tropics were a hotbed of disease, and it was inevitable that a score of men would fall victim to fever, scurvy, dysentery, or wounds from combat or accident. It was a priority to construct a sick tent or house where these men could be quarantined and treated. They would be given special food, such as turtle broth or coconut milk, and even healing herbs, if they could be found. Even though I necessarily haven't found any documentation of it, it is certain that the pirates constructed tents or houses for their diversions. It is well known that they spent most of their camping time drinking and feasting. If they could be found, they might bring in women to keep them company. This hard partying made them susceptible to surprise attacks from pirate hunters, and it was necessary to construct defenses. These were usually quite rudimentary, earthenworks erected from the sand of the beach and mounted with the ship's cannons. Nonetheless, these could be successful enough. Bannister's battery was able to fend off a naval assault when they attacked his careenage. The pirates stood their ground until the navy ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, but only after sinking Bannister's flagship. Some would say that the best defense is a good offense, and while encamped, many pirates would take canoes or even a smaller ship and scout the vicinity, either to keep track of enemy movements or even to capture smaller prizes, perhaps even specialists or workers for the procedure. After the preparations had been made, and whilst or after the camp had been constructed, the crew made ready to beach the ship and careen her. A quick note before we continue with our story. The channel has not been doing well recently, despite my efforts to improve the narration, editing, and audiovisual elements, aside from making videos on a broad selection of topics in order to see what people enjoy, without anything really finding success. Views and viewer support is what allows me to continue producing these videos. I'm not sure if the algorithm is hiding my videos from subscribers and potential viewers, or if people just aren't interested anymore. But if you enjoy watching them and want to see more, you have to click the subscribe button and notification bell, or even join a Discord server where new releases are announced with a ping notification. Donations, channel membership, and especially Patreon support helps immensely. And on Patreon you can also watch the videos as they are intended, without ads and sponsorships. The first step in careening the vessel was to empty her. All of the cargo, cannons, furniture, anything that could be removed, was removed. The bottom of the hold was infested with rats and vermin. These could be chased out by burning befitting materials in the hold to literally smoke him out. Afterwards, the sails and rigging were removed from the masts. It was imperative to shut every port, hatch, and window. Otherwise, these could flood with water when the ship was tipped and sink it. There were multiple ways in which the ship could be tipped on its side and secured. Most common was to beach it until the next tide, and connect the sides of the ship to nearby trees via blocks and tackles. These were then pulled to bring the ship on her side. Alternatively, one could use another vessel to tip the ship over. If the waters were too shallow or the beach was rocky, the pirates could make a makeshift platform by sinking another ship, and then parking the ship to be careened upon the sunken ship. When the ship had been heaved, the next step was to clean away the barnacles, weeds, and other maritime growths that had infested the bottom. Most effective was to bream it. This operation was performed by holding burning bundles of reeds to the bottom, so that the layer of pitch and sulfur under the maritime growths would catch fire and cast off the infestations. The breaming was supplanted by vigorous scraping. When the bottom had been fully cleaned, the planking damaged by the teredo was smashed apart and replaced with fresh wood. The inner hull of the ship was protected by the sheathing. This was a layer intended to stop the shipworms. The inner layer consisted of some sort of mixture intended to stop, trap, or even kill the shipworms. Usually it was just tar, but some would mix in pounded glass and cow's hair to trap and cut up the worms, essentially like barbed wire. This mixture was then covered up with an outer sheet of thin planking. All of this had to be replaced, in addition to plugging leaks and caulking. You see, the planking of the ship wasn't airtight. The wood would shrink and swell depending on the temperature, and there would always be some gaps in between. A wooden vessel is always leaking to some degree, hence the need for constant pumping. But the biggest gaps were caulked, which means that you fill the gaps with an insulating material called oakum. This is a fiber, often old ropes, coated with tar. Crafty pirates might produce oakum from tree fibers, or even the hair on coconuts. The caulking could not only be damaged by vermin and gunfire, but by the weather. Hot temperatures would melt it and cause leaks. A preventive measure was to stretch a sailcloth tent over the decks to cool them, and also to provide refuge for the sailors. Another was parceling. This involved taking a length of cloth, long enough to cover the caulked seam, and then cover it with tar or pitch to glue it stuck. After the bottom had been burned, scraped, plugged, and resheeted, it was paid, covered with a protective mixture called graving or greaving. It served three purposes. For one, to keep away future infestations, to lubricate the ship and improve speed, and to serve as fuel to catch fire and burn away infestations when the ship was breamed next. There were multiple recipes for the graving. One of the most popular called for train oil, rosin, and brimstone. Another for tallow, soap, and brimstone. Arsenic might be added to poison the sea creatures. Lime was also a common ingredient, and would give the bottoms their signature white coat. Crafty pirates could make their own lime from seashells. Otherwise, pitch was a difficult material to come by. Local natives might have a supplement, and materials were often purchased or acquired locally. When the bottom had been successfully cleaned, the process had to be repeated for the other side. The rest of the ship's woodwork was likewise anointed, the hull varnished with tar or turpentine to protect against the sun and weather. Give her a good coat, as the sailors said. Spars which were often used, like the masts of sloops and schooners and the topmasts of larger ships, were paid with hog's lard, butter, or tallow. Other damages to the ship were likewise repaired, including those done to the hull, rigging, and masts. The primary material was wood. This could be acquired by making fresh planking by cutting down local trees and sawing them up. But many pirates would salvage materials from shipwrecks. If they had a prize ship, they might sink it to recycle the wood. You might call them eco-friendly. More delicate parts of the ship might have been damaged and require restoration, such as the machinery. Pumps were some of the most vital parts of a ship, since they were always leaking to some degree and needed a way to keep the water out. Naturally, the best pumps were purpose-made in cities, but crude pumps could be constructed in a pinch, entirely out of wood. The South Sea pirates learned how to make these pumps from the Spanish, and making cylinders for the pump boxes was especially difficult. The sailmakers were put to work patching any damaged sails. Materials were hard to come by. Some pirates were documented as using clothing to mend their sails. The masts were likewise repaired. Some had to be cut down to a shorter size in case of damage, or just to make them easier to handle. The bases of the masts were also woolded, wrapped up in cables to stabilize them. New ropes might be necessary. West Indian pirates would often make new cordage from the bark of the mayho. It is made up of strings with very strong threads. These were drawn off in flakes or threads, and then used for caulking or weaving into cordage. When the ship had been fully cleaned and repaired, the pirates might just load her up again and cast off. Or they might look into modifications. This involved the adding of gun and oar ports, swivel stanchions, trimming down heavy superstructures to make the ship faster and more seaworthy, and the removal of internal partitions to further reduce weight. As a result, pirate ships became lean, mean killing machines. A crucial component of careening was picking a secure location, isolated from evil eyes. The process made them susceptible to surprise attacks from sea and land, but dangers were also posed by their own incompetence. Pirates were often their worst enemy, owing to their tendency of alcoholism. You might have heard about it. This often made them do dumb and outright dangerous things, and they would often get drunk while working, even with dangerous assignments. During one repair process, a gang of drunk pirates managed to overset a canoe full of ironwork, drowning one of the men. Incompetence could also be a source of severe loss and casualty. When Captain Edward Lowe set about careening his flagship, the Rose Pink, the crew were so eager to heave the ship down that they forgot that the captain and surgeon were still inside. They had also forgotten to close the ports, and water began rushing inside. Lowe narrowly managed to save himself and the surgeon, but 2 other guys caught in the accident drowned, and the ship and all her provisions were lost. The oversized crew had to sustain themselves on rations aboard a smaller ship not big enough to house all of them. Pirates were usually on good terms with indigenous peoples, usually because they didn't have much in terms of loot, were useful allies and trade partners, and messing with them was a heap of trouble. In 1723, Captain Lothar trespassed on native territory when careening. His camp was taken by surprise, the pirates managing to escape, but not after losing their flagship and all of their plunder. So, measures had to be taken to defend the camp, set up patrols, guard duties, and defenses. The most impressive works were erected by the aforementioned Bannister, who managed to defend his camp against a naval assault. Even though Bannister lost his flagship, the stalemate won him enough time to escape in a smaller vessel, even though he was eventually captured and hanged at sea without a trial. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.